Charlie Javice looked like the perfect startup founder. She was young, Ivy League, media-friendly, and building a company that seemed to solve a real problem. The fintech startup, called Frank, promised to make college financing easier for students. And then JPMorgan bought it for $175 million. But the asset that made Frank valuable was fake. After his founding, Frank quickly got the attention of the market, and Javice got the kind of profile that startups dream about. She even landed on the Forbes 30 under 30 list, which in startup land is basically a shortcut to credibility. Sam Bankman-Fried later made the same list. Then came the big moment. JPMorgan Chase bought Frank for $175 million. That sounds like your classic success story. A founder builds a company, the company gets acquired, and everyone wins. But in this case, the real story was hiding underneath the surface, because the company's most valuable asset, the one thing that made it valuable enough for JPMorgan to buy, was not nearly as real as it appeared. The user data was fake. That's what turned Charlie Javice from a promising fintech founder into a convicted fraudster. Charlie Javice was born in 1992 and grew up in New Jersey. She later studied finance and management at the University of Pennsylvania. After college, she launched Frank in 2017 as a student-focused fintech company designed to navigate the complex world of student financing. Javice was the kind of founder investors and the media like to put on a pedestal. Smart, polished, and able to make a simple consumer finance product sound bigger than it was. She understood the startup language of traction, mission, and momentum, and Frank's story gave her a clean, compelling pitch, one that looked socially useful, scalable, and easy to believe. That image helped her stand out in a crowded fintech world, where attention can matter almost as much as the product itself. Frank's business model was to make money by using his platform to capture student traffic and convert that into partner value, rather than by charging students directly. It centered on financial aid, scholarships, and related services, which could then be monetized through referrals, partnerships, and premium add-ons. Javice chose the name Frank as it felt friendly and accessible. And of course, it also means honesty. Frank raised over $15 million in funding by 2018, suggesting it was still being financed as a growth company rather than relying on a steady stream of revenue. It was the kind of business that lived and died by trust, scale, and numbers. And that matters, because in the startup world, it's not enough to say that your product is helpful. You have to prove people are actually using it. And that is where Frank's story becomes more complicated. Javice told the market, and eventually JPMorgan, that Frank had around 4.25 million registered users. And at that size, it looked like a real platform with serious reach, something a bank would want to own. And JPMorgan did want to own it, and other banks such as Capital One were also interested. JPMorgan saw the possibility of folding Frank into its own consumer business and using it to reach a younger customer base. In September 2021, JPMorgan agreed to buy the company for $175 million. Not bad for a company with a database and just 18 staff. By then, Javice had already positioned herself as the face of the clever, fast-growing business. She reportedly walked away with about $21 million from the sale, plus a separate contract to stay on after the acquisition, with a $20 million retention bonus. But the numbers behind the sale were not what they seemed. To understand the fraud, you have to understand what JPMorgan was actually buying. It was not just a brand. JPMorgan saw synergies in the client database. The value of Frank depended on the idea it had millions of real student users. So when JPMorgan started due diligence, which is the process of kicking the tires of a potential acquisition, they did what any serious buyer would do. They asked for the underlying customer data. And that is where the fraud started. The real number of users was around 293,000. Still a real business, but nowhere near the 4.25 million figure that had been promoted. At first, Javice stonewalled. However, she had an idea. She brought in Adam Capelna, a data science and math professor who had gone to Wharton and later taught at Queens College, which is part of City University in New York. She paid him about $18,000 to create a synthetic data set, which he said was to be used for data modeling and research, and not to be presented as real data. Capelna took the true database and used synthetic data methods to expand it into 4.3 million fake records. He generated names by mixing and matching elements from Frank's real records, so names and personal details did not look to be obviously fabricated. He made sure things like geography, age ranges, college choices, and other demographics would appear consistent with an actual student population. The fake email addresses all included numbers to give the impression of uniqueness. Javice delivered the fake records to JPMorgan for checking. One example that presented itself at the subsequent trial was a supposed user named Catherine Gordy, complete with address, phone number, email, and other details. But Capelna testified that Ms. Gordy does not exist. JPMorgan used outside support for the due diligence data evaluation. However, their check was superficial. They checked that all the data was formatted correctly, that all the fields had been completed, there were no repetitions, and that it all looked believable. And for a while, it all seemed to have worked. So how did the fraud unravel? When JPMorgan tried to use the data, the cracks started showing. They sent emails, they ran campaigns, they tried to integrate the customer list into their systems, and things did not add up. For example, in January 2022, JPMorgan ran a test email campaign to about 400,000 supposed Frank customers. Only about 28% of the emails were delivered, versus a normal 99%, and engagement was near zero. That triggered suspicion. In mid-2022, JPMorgan launched an internal investigation into the Frank acquisition. They went back through Frank's internal systems and checked the logs. They reviewed the backups and compared what had been given to what actually existed. Instead of 4.25 million users, the real number was much closer to under 300,000. This is not a minor exaggeration or normal startup optimism. That is the difference between a legitimate growth story and a company being sold on a false foundation. And at that point, the case became much bigger than a bad spreadsheet. After that investigation, JPMorgan formally flagged the issue. Regulators and prosecutors stepped in. They looked at the communications, the invoice for the data work, and the fake customer list itself. The picture that emerged was not of a company making harmless marketing mistakes. It was a coordinated effort to inflate the value of the business by manufacturing a fake version of its user base. By late 2022, JPMorgan fired Charlie Javice and Olivia Amar, Frank's chief growth officer, meaning sales and marketing. The government duly charged Charlie Javice with bank fraud, wire fraud, securities fraud, and conspiracy to commit fraud. In plain English, she lied to the bank, used electronic channels to push the lie forward, misrepresented the company's value, and did it as part of a scheme. Javice pleaded not guilty. Her defense argued that the figures were estimates and that JPMorgan should have caught the problem during its own due diligence. But the jury did not accept that explanation. In March 2025, she was found guilty on all counts. Later that year, she was sentenced to just over 7 years in federal prison. The judge described the scheme as biblical in scale. The prosecutors described it as brazen fraud built on synthetic data. Currently, she remains free on a $2 million bond while appealing her conviction. Amar was sentenced to 6 years in prison. He is also free while appealing. Kapilna testified for the government and became part of the case against Javice. He has faced criticism for agreeing to build such a massive fake data set, but he was not charged as a defendant. This was not a Ponzi scheme. It is not a crypto collapse. It is something more modern and in some ways more alarming. It is a fraud built on data. It is about how much the modern economy depends on numbers that can be manufactured, packaged, and sold before anyone checks whether they actually mean anything. Like Theranos, it was built on a lie. It shows how modern fraud doesn't always look chaotic or sloppy. Sometimes it looks clean, professional, and perfectly packaged, right up until the numbers are tested. Javice had painted herself into a corner. She was not prepared to backpedal after overstating the client numbers, presumably hoping that all would be lost and forgotten within the massive JPMorgan. From student loan paperwork to federal fraud, this is another reminder that in white-collar crime, the most dangerous lies are often the ones that look clean, organized, and perfectly professional. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Crooks and Suits. Please remember to leave a like, make a comment, and subscribe.